I want to welcome you all to this panel, Reimagining a Gender-Inclusive Financial Architecture for Poverty Eradication. This is the central piece, the main dish of this edition of the CSW. So welcome to all. Allow me to introduce you to the speakers. We have an incredible, amazing lineup. We are very thankful to have them with us. His Excellency Ambassador Denis Francis. He's the President of the UN General Assembly. Her Excellency Sima Bauhaus. She's the Executive Director of UN Women. Mr. Juan Jose Martinez Badillo, he's the chief of UNCTAD in New York. UNCTAD, as you know, is the UN Conference on Trade and Development. We have Muzna Siddiqui. She is the Global Governance Research and Planning Associate at the United Nations University, the Center for Policy Research. So we cannot have better. And we have among us His Excellency, the Chief of Cabinet of the President of the General Assembly, Ambassador Colin Vivian Kelapile. As you see, this is really a high-level event, and we're very thankful that you're joining us.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by thanking GWL Voices, its president and founder, Susana Malcora, and its executive director, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, one of my predecessors, and indeed, one of only 4 women to lead this principal organ of the United Nations as President of the General Assembly. Permit me to acknowledge, in particular, Executive Director Espinosa, and to commend her as a true champion of women's rights, demonstrated both during and after her remarkable presidency of the General Assembly for its 73rd session. In this room, we all agree that achieving gender equality and advancing women's rights are integral to fulfilling our Sustainable Development Goals and to empowering not only the individuals, but our communities and societies at large. Yet today, 1 in every 10 women live in extreme poverty. And at the current trajectory, over 340 million women and girls will remain trapped in extreme poverty by 2030. If we are to reverse these trends and to ensure zero poverty for women and girls by 2030, we must collectively take urgent and comprehensive action. It is truly crucial that our efforts prioritize long-standing gender disparities. Frankly, the statistics are appalling. In 2024, nearly 2.4 billion women still do not enjoy the same economic rights as men. The gap between men and women's expected lifetime earnings globally is $172 trillion, nearly 2 times the world's annual gross domestic product. In 2019, women's share of total earned labor income stood at a paltry 34%. And at current rates of progress, the next generation of women would still need to spend 2.3 hours more than men per day on average on unpaid care and domestic work. Excellencies, chronic underinvestment in gender equality slows progress and in some instances even reverses the gains we have made in addressing gender inequalities. Conversely, adequate financing and well-designed and properly targeted macroeconomic, structural, and financial policies can vastly accelerate the reduction of gender disparities and support the equitable advancement of women and girls, and indeed society at large. UN Women's latest Gender Snapshot report emphasizes the need for an additional $360 billion annually to realize SDG 5, including to end poverty and hunger. At the international level, financing for development must prioritize policies and programs designed to close gender gaps and to empower women and girls. It is also essential that we identify strategies to mobilize our limited resources more effectively. We must implement a new international financial architecture that can better address the gender inequalities and support the advancement of women and girls, particularly those in developing countries. I take this opportunity to acknowledge and to commend the International Monetary Fund's recently launched inaugural gender mainstreaming strategy, which illuminates this vitally important yet often overlooked issue. To this end, the upcoming 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, to be held in Spain in 2025, will be a key opportunity to build on the financing commitments towards implementation of all the SDGs, including SDG 5. Excellencies, in addition to the moral imperative of ensuring equal rights for women and girls, championing gender equality has the practical benefit of unlocking all of humanity's full potential. By removing barriers hindering half of the global population from utilizing their fullest talents and capabilities, we will accelerate our efforts towards a more just, resilient, and sustainable society. Therefore, it is crucial to emphasize that financing for gender equality is not only essential, but also a cost-effective investment, an investment that will act as a catalyst for rapid progress in various interconnected areas, including education, healthcare, and employment, thereby laying the groundwork for a more equitable and comprehensive approach to development. Let us collectively recommit to ensuring that gender equality remains a priority on local, national, regional, and global agendas. And let us also use this opportunity to reaffirm that impactful change, including in financing, necessitates ensuring the presence of more women in decision-making spaces and leadership positions, standards the world has consistently failed to meet. Clearly, much needs to change. As President of the General Assembly, I am fully committed both to incentivizing and contributing to this change. This commitment is why I consistently prioritize gender parity in my responsibilities, including in appointing co-facilitators and for invitations to speakers and guests for various General Assembly events. Moreover, I continue to join the advocacy for more female candidates for the positions of Secretary General and President of the General Assembly, acknowledging the need for more women to be represented at the highest levels. With strengthened resolve, let us all be motivated advocates in seeking the long overdue change for a fairer and more gender equal world. I thank you.
And once again, you showed, Mr. President, that you are a true gender champion. Thank you for reminding us that investing in gender equality is a cost-effective investment, but it is also an issue of rights. So thank you very much for these very inspiring opening remarks. And now I have the privilege to give the floor also for opening remarks to the Executive Director of UN Women, Madame Sima Bonhaus, and a great friend.
President of the UN General Assembly, and also Your Excellency, my good friend, Ambassador Maria Fernanda, Executive Director of JW Voices, and distinguished excellencies, ambassadors, guests, and everyone here in this room. I extend my gratitude to the group of Women Leaders Voices, the GWL, for change and inclusion, and the Office of the President of the General Assembly for this invitation. And I must say, what a privilege it is to be sitting next to two PGAs. One current, one former, one man, one woman. And this is the way it should be. This is gender equality, and I think this is what we should all be. This is what we should all be working towards, and we are all working towards. I truly appreciate this dialogue on the CSW 68 priority theme, Reimagining a Gender-Inclusive Financial Architecture for Poverty Eradication. Women's rights are inextricably woven into all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Regrettably, escalating violence, the climate crisis disproportionately impact women, exacerbating poverty and inequality. Estimates show us that if current trends persist, by 2030, an estimated 8% of women worldwide will still be trapped in poverty. Investing in women is a fundamental human rights issue. Yet, our profit-driven global financial architecture often prioritizes investor interests over women's needs, thus perpetuating inequality. Excellencies, the value of women's unpaid care work remains uncounted. More than half of the world's women work in precarious, unpaid, informal economies. Only 1 in 4 women are covered by social protection systems. Even worse, debt service payments in half of the world's poorest countries are 171% of social spending, jeopardizing critical social services for ensuring women's welfare. To end women's poverty and to achieve gender equality, we need an additional $360 billion annually. To achieve this, we need a reprioritization of financing. And you know, this $360 billion annually is just a fraction of what the world spends on weapons every year. And it is almost equal to what the world spends on coffee every year. So I think we can afford these $360 billion annually to be put for financing actually gender equality and women's empowerment. We need comprehensive national development policies and financing strategies that prioritize redistribution, progressive taxation, targeted investment, and increased development finance. Linked to this, I urge also for an increase in targeted official development assistance, ODA, for women and girls living in poverty, which currently only stands, I will raise my voice, which currently only stands at 4% of total bilateral aid. I call...
Shima.
Yes?
This
This is
it's
good
working.
now?
Just hold something power on to it. You took it.
Complex development policies.
All right. Yeah.
Icon.
I think I finished. I also urge for an increase in targeted official development assistance for women and girls living in poverty, which currently only stands at 4% of total bilateral aid. I call on transformative reforms of the multilateral development banks to scale up gender-focused development finance. We at UN Women proudly serve as the co-chairs of the Finance in Common Summit Coalition on Gender Equality and Women Empowerment, which convenes 89 development banks to explore best practices in gender finance. We must commit to investing in and build rule-based systems and social institutions that can tackle gender inequality and structural poverty. We also need to significantly invest in high-quality public services and social protection for women and girls living in poverty. This includes quality education and decent work, affordable health care, food, clean energy, water, sanitation, and hygiene. We need to invest in care as a strategy for an inclusive and equitable future for all. And Excellencies, we can achieve what we have set out to do in this commission, just as we can get back on track to the Sustainable Development Goals. But to do this, we must engage all stakeholders, including member states, the private sector, civil society, capital markets, and academia. And we look ahead to the Summit of the Future in September to have an opportunity to be bold, to reaffirm strong commitment to a world that is just, equal, peaceful, and in harmony with the planet. So achieving gender equality demands systemic change in the international financial system and unwavering political will. Let us unite in our resolve to overhaul the global financial architecture, ensuring true inclusivity and fairness for all. I thank you and wish us all a productive CSW 68. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Madam Executive Director. I think that we were all shocked at the data and the numbers. Yes, we need 360 billion to fund gender equality, and it's not too much to ask, you said. It's what we spend in coffee every year, a little fraction of the expenditure in weapons in the world. So I would say basically your message is funding gender equality is a political choice and can be done. But what is holding us back? I ask you this question, Juan Jose Martinez Padillo, representative of UNCTAD in New York. What is holding us back? Why is it that poverty continues to have women's face?
Thank you, Executive Director, and I would like to, of course, inform you or express my honor to be in these distinguished panels, and particularly, of course, salute the President of the General Assembly and to pass the warm regards of A.J. Greenspan, who would have wished to be here. All the commitment have held her from being here, but I really want to personally then express my wish to be a champion, just like the President of the GA is of this cause, and to support in this process, and to thank you and President Macora of the GWL Voices for the invitation. Of course, I acknowledge USG Barrows and my dear friend Musne and Ambassador Kelatire. I would like to, moderator, if you allow me, to perhaps focus on the interlinkages as to why we are actually, what is the interlinkage of the current situation that we're facing in terms of debt, in terms of the reform of the IFA, and the agenda of financing the SG5 and gender equality in general. And from that, the argument that we have been trying to advance is that, yes, we are not in a debt crisis because there haven't been major defaults, but we are in a development crisis. And why do we call it a development crisis, which perhaps is more sinister than a debt crisis, is because it is people, especially women and girls, that are suffering from the delay or the avoiding the expenditure on achieving the SDGs. So that is kind of the argument, the overall argument that we're building. Some of you will be familiar with the UNCTAD report, The World of Debt, that came out last year. And in that report, we particularly came up with one statistic that is very striking, which is that 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt servicing, than on education or health. So that means precisely you can see that expenditure that is being driven to paying for debt services is actually a foregone investment, a missing investment in terms of education and health, two that are very directly linked to SDG 5 and to gender equality and to economic empowerment of women. So, as you would imagine, not all of those 3.3 billion people are equally affected. We know that the poor tend to be disproportionately affected, women and girls tend to be disproportionately affected, in particular when the foregone investment is on social protection, economic empowerment, and others that are not being put to use. So we agree that economic empowerment of women is an issue of human rights, and gender equality is an issue of human rights, but as PGA mentioned,
That's the best.
The mic is on.
Yeah.
Yeah, the mic working.
The mic is
It's okay if you don't and gender equality rises.
So,
I think we can continue with just a quick interruption to say, yes, the UN needs to be reformed. This is an example that we need a UN 2.0, a multilateralism. Please, to continue.
absolutely. So as PGA said before, and USG Bahamas as well, it's not only an issue of rights, it's not an issue of human rights, but it's a good investment. It's a necessary condition to achieve sustainable development. Because austerity tends to have a disproportionate impact on women and girls, but at the same time, we see, for instance, that women tend to be the first one to be forced out of the labor force, of the labor market, in order to provide care within the household, home-based care often. So in doing so, it's not only the labor, the total amount of labor that is reduced, but it's also an issue of innovation, entrepreneurial leadership capacities of women that are driven out of that market. But it's not only about the market, because we have seen that when there's countries that have had a high increase of the female participation in the labor force, but without making the necessary investment in social care provisioning and in better distribution of caregiving, ultimately compromise their long-term capacity to grow, because the underlying conditions are not there. Now, as USG Bahut mentioned before, we are far from where we should be. We saw, for instance, at the SDG Summit that 15% of the SDGs are on track. If we look at SDG 5 on gender equality, this is only 13%. And for instance, the World Bank issued a report recently where they say that 3.9 billion women face legal barrier affecting their economic participation. So basically, almost all women in the world. This report of the World Bank also said that when you count safety and childcare, no single country has been able to close the gender gap. No single country in the world. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done. I think some of the numbers that have come up, we have a joint effort with UN Women on SDG cost. So figuring out how much it will cost to achieve the SDG, in particular how much we're missing as compared to the current state of expenditure. And from all the 6 pathways plus gender equality that we studied, gender equality is the most, would be the most expensive to achieve at 360 billion short. This is what we're missing to get there. This is actually, to put it in perspective, 20% of the GDP of the 48 countries that were in that study. So it's a very large amount of money, but for some countries like LDCs and SEEDs, it goes as high as 40%. So these are huge amounts of investment that we need to put into place. We are talking about some $1,400 per person per year, which for some of these countries is an incredibly high amount of money. 6% increased yearly expenditure. So it's. I guess the question is, where is the money coming from? We know that there has to be a combination of public and private. We know that there's many sources, but the first ingredient that we see that needs to be put is a reform of the governance of the international financial institution. And this is needed in addition to shorter-term measures that can be implemented within the existing governance. So we have kind of a long-term and a shorter game that we need to go into. We see that rising debt burdens and debt reimbursement compete with the kind of investment that we need to do. So we need to make sure that countries have actually the space, the fiscal space, to make sure to put the resources where they have to be. Just to put it in perspective, developing countries in the 10 years from 2010 to 2021 increased the debt as a percentage of GDP from 35 to 60%. And in that same period, the amount of government revenue that goes to servicing debt went from 6 to 16%. So we would have 10% of GDP that we could be devoting to achieving the SDG, but right now it is going to simply paying and servicing debt. There are some good news, of course, because we, in those 360 billion, we also see that investment would have the largest synergy with other SDGs. So investing in gender equality every dollar we spend in gender equality is not only $1 of gender equality impact, it's an impact across the board in all of the SDGs. So I think it's a good investment, a cost-effective investment is the word that the PGA used. I think in the interest of time, I will perhaps not go right now into the details of the kind of proposals that we're putting on the table. What I wanted to maybe leave you with in this part is one, in terms of the benefit of the investment, is one number that the World Bank put, and they actually estimate that closing the gender gap would raise global GDP by 20%. So we see, for instance, that the kind of world that we can imagine if we actually manage to do this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing up the issue of the need to change the governance of international financial institutions, how decisions are made, how, gender positive investments, but gender positive decision making in international financial institutions. And, just thinking, if we close the gender gap, 20% more of the GDP, it's definitely a win-win, besides the issue of justice and rights that we are talking about. And so thank you for that and for the excellent work that UNCTAD is doing on the issue of debt, which is absolutely critical. You said countries need the fiscal and policy space to invest in closing the gender inequality gap, which is across the board. 193 countries are suffering from that. Some more than others, of course. But let me now turn to Musna Siddiqui. From your eyes as an expert, but also as a young professional, what is the agenda for young women? What is that you would like to see change in the international financial architecture so it delivers for women, especially for young women and younger generations?
And typically in these conversations, there tends to be a veering towards discussing the challenges and the obstacles that we face. But I'd also like to draw attention to the fact that actually a lot of positive developments have been made as well in the multilateral system. So, for instance, if we go back to the UN 75 declaration, member states came together to make key commitments to put women and girls at the center of multilateralism. And this process followed on towards our common agenda process that took place recently as well, and has fed into the more recent zero draft of the Pact for the Future, which is part of the Summit of the Future process as well. And explicitly in the zero draft, member states and the co-facilitators have agreed to reaffirm their commitments to the Beijing Declaration, which is a very key and pivotal moment in the history of gender equality, and also more broadly to achieving gender equality and bridging specific divides, for instance, the gender digital divide as an example. Even within the IFIs, as the PJ mentioned earlier, we've seen positive developments with the IMF promoting its recent gender mainstreaming strategy and the World Bank also releasing its gender strategy between 2024 to 2030. So there's a lot of different proposals at the table that can be taken forward to not only promote gender equality, but more so from an intersectional perspective that not only addresses the different factors that women are faced with, but also the different backgrounds they come from, whether they are old or young, depending on which ethnicities they're from, etc. So I'll outline 3 particular issues and recommendations that I think could be taken forward and could be very impactful for gender equality with regards to reforming the IFA. The first is the need for gender disaggregated data collection. We have seen that actually gender disaggregated data helps policymakers in making stronger and evidence-based policy making. It also assists the private sector and banks in developing tailor-made products for women and girls based on their unique needs, and it also fosters digital inclusion. However, these gender statistics often tend to be quite sparse, infrequent, and also out of date. In an example from UN Women itself, there are approximately 42% of countries which have official statistics on monetary poverty have sex disaggregated data. So there's a huge gap over there that needs to be filled. A lot of the financing as well that goes into financing gender data is volatile and is subject to yearly change. 90% of the funding comes from only 4 countries. So Canada, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and Australia, and also in addition by the World Bank as well. During COVID-19, when countries committed to providing ODA assistance, and they provided relief in August 2020, only 0.4% of the $16 billion that was provided focused explicitly on data and statistics. And only 11% of that was focused on gender data. So that goes to show that there is clear need for this. So one potential solution that could be taken forward in the coming months, especially in the summer of the future, is promoting an international decade for data. And this was a recommendation proposed by the Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. International decades are multilateral tools that have been used very successfully in the past by the United Nations to raise awareness on key issues, and the Decade for Women was a key example of that. It promoted it led to a lot of positive developments in promoting gender equality. So specifically, an International Decade for Data could raise awareness on the value and the significance of gender disaggregated data, especially amongst the private sector as well. And it could create global standards on the collection of data and enable improved coordination amongst different multilateral actors, including civil society and and private sector and other relevant communities as well. A second example, or a second key focus rather, within the IFI specifically, would be to promote diversity and inclusion in the leadership roles and also in the hiring processes. This was alluded to earlier in the conversation as well. In the IMF, only 3 out of 24 women currently are executive directors, and only 3 out of 31 women are alternative executive directors in the IMF. And this number actually decreased from 5 to 3 in April 2023. So there needs to be a lot of work done over here. The IMF has set voluntary targets for women in senior advisory positions, but in their own words, they agree that there is fragility in maintaining upward momentum. So there is an agreement that a lot needs to be done over here, and countries, for instance, the United States, are supportive of promoting this. For instance, in the annual meetings of the World Bank, which took place earlier in October this year, the United States supported promoting gender diversity in the IMF Executive Board, such as through developing medium-term and voluntary objectives to strengthen gender diversity targets. But beyond this, other recommendations could be taken forward as well, such as sharing best practices to develop active pipelines of female candidates. McKinsey has noted that this is extremely an important element of a successful board inclusion effort. And in addition, accountability frameworks can be useful, as well as promoting gender targets, which are a proven policy solution to increase the representation of women in the workforce. Additionally, in the hiring process, individuals could receive unconscious bias training. Applications could use gendered language, and quotas could be adopted to promote the inclusion of women. And just finally, as I'll touch upon another topic that was mentioned during the course of this panel, which is the need to integrate gender perspectives into macroeconomic policymaking and frameworks. Typically, macroeconomic policy tends to deal with economic aggregates without any references to gender, and they claim to be gender neutral, but actually they do have impacts on the livelihood of women. So as an example, going back to the topic of debt, which Juan Jose raised, the costs of servicing debt are disproportionately borne by women, such as through cuts to social protection or to healthcare or gender-based violence prevention. So therefore, a lot more effort and a lot more interest is needed on the base of the international community to invest in this. And this could be done, for instance, through investing in infrastructures, especially digital infrastructure, to promote and include women in the digital economy. In addition to processes that could close gender wage gaps. Another example could be strengthening social protection mechanisms so that women fall under the safety net, as well as incorporating gender perspectives into debt sustainability and the design of loan conditionalities. So specifically for youth and for young women, these could be very important ideas that could set them up and prepare them to fulfill their rights and especially their right to development as well. So I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you, thank you. And thank you, first of all, for reminding us that we have made progress, and it's not all so bleak, reminding us about the UN Political Declaration, Digital Compact, and, to all the instruments that are out there. Now the big question is about implementation and delivering in action on the ground, and thank you for your 3 very concrete proposals on gender disaggregated data, on diversity, inclusivity, and representation of women at the top levels in the multilateral banks, but also the gender-sensitive macroeconomic policy that are usually headlines, but then we don't go into the details, what it means in terms of investment, priority setting, gender-sensitive budgets at the national level. So thank you very much. We have, as you know, at 6, the lights are going to be again, but this time, for good. So I would suggest, before coming back to our panel for their closing statements, I would like to open the floor for comments and questions, short comments and questions. Please do introduce yourselves, and you're welcome to participate. Once again, and sorry for the ones that are standing up throughout these months. Please. Let's try to use the microphone, see if they work.
Hello. Okay, yes, my name is Vedanshi. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Bolt Safety Society. It's a youth tech startup meets nonprofit fighting sexual violence. So based on my, experience in social impact, that what happens is nowadays we're seeing a lot of band-aid solutions to issues of social, social injustices. For instance, if a child is hungry, donating and feeding that child once doesn't mean that child's going to be fed for life. So what I'm wondering is that this $360 billion number that you have presented, to what extent is sustainable impact considered as opposed to annual band-aid solutions or donations? I'm just curious to learn more on that side. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having this important conversation and also renting the space for all of our inputs as well. I would just like to share some comments or recommendations, as you could call them, when we're talking especially about reformation of the international financial architecture and especially calling for gender inclusive financial architecture. I think since the priority theme for this year is also around financing, and when we're talking about financing, we cannot include the severe adverse impact that debt crisis has on especially countries, developing countries and countries in the global south. So when we're talking about reformation of the international financial architecture, we really call for the inclusion of indebted countries in debt resolution mechanisms and to ensure that all debt resolution mechanisms are sustainable, democratic and participatory. We also, while I was listening to Usna, thank you so much for all of your recommendations. They're all very welcome. And we're also really happy to hear of all the advancements that IFIs like the World Bank and IMF are making with regards to gender inclusion. Good for them. And honestly, it's about time that organizations, institutions such as those do take those measures. But we would also like to recommend gender audits and human rights assessment of all the loan conditionalities that are being talked about as part of debt restructuring mechanisms to ensure that we are not compromising human rights and fundamental rights of women and girls around the world. And when we're talking about loan conditionality, there's one thing that I would like to differ with you, Rusma, is that when you spoke about making sure that there are gender perspectives that are included in loan conditionalities, I think what we are calling for is absolute cancellation of loan conditionalities and of all the unsustainable debt in the world, because there is no point in beautifying these loan conditionalities as long as they are ongoing at the expense of fundamental rights of women and girls. Thank you.
How can we give more representation for young women and young girls in spaces? As you may be aware, the Congress of Deputies in Mexico City is trying to engage youth above 25 and how the disparities can be implemented to give spaces even though it's very limited. How can we engage in giving spaces to young women to represent the youth in displaced communities, like indigenous rights, indigenous youth? That's very mostly important, not just for Mexico, also for the Caribbean and Latin America. and also for Africa. We need to have those representations as well. That would be my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
People often think that the care economy in the US and other places, that we don't need the monies for the people who are working to actually support their parents and elderly people. What can we do to provide more monies for the elderly people to be taken care of, and that they are not experiencing, if they're 62 or 65 or 70, there's a certain amount of money that it can't come to them in that time. And this is happening to whether people are in rural areas or are middle class. Their children do not have enough money to put there to take care of them, or they can't get a caregiver because their insurance won't cover it. What can we do to support women that are in those cases? Because it falls on women for that, as well as taking care of their children. So my question to the panel is, how can we support those women in everyday areas? We're talking about digitization, but in rural areas, people don't even have access to that. So what can we do?
I'm from Brazil, and have been 10 years I'm struggling to save my husband's life, and hopefully we could provide the professional care he needed to save his life in Connecticut, the only place who had the treatment in all over the world. We have been to Europe, Germany, and during all this struggling, we can see that I could not receive any help, and I could not receive a governmental help. Could not work too, and it's not a sad story, because we are developing a new policy in Brazil to help other people. But I see that I could receive help from family and friends, and I see that I had this lucky story, and I believe that other women could not have all this lucky. And my question is how all this money could reach also these caregivers that needs to take care of people that are sick in the family and cannot work, because I believe it's a very beautiful work to do when someone in your family needs help and there's no one to take care. And almost all these caregivers are women.
My name is Avi Love. I use they, them pronouns. I'm here with the League of Women Voters, but in my day work, I work for a statewide organization in California that we run about 100 programs across the state in harm reduction, restorative justice, unhoused assistance. And I would say those of us in senior leadership, our job is effectively navigating bureaucracy to get people the help they need. So asking the foremost experts in the world on navigating bureaucracy, what needs to be done, in order to streamline, what have we learned from COVID response and crises, what have we learned in the UN so far, so that when we're addressing crises, when people need help, we're actually getting them the help they need before the loss is too great.
Give the floor first to Musla and then Juan Jose, and then we will have closing very short remarks from our distinguished guests, the PTA and the Executive Director. So, Musla.
Thank you to everybody who has asked us questions. I'll speak to the lady who asked me the question on both conditionalities. Ultimately, the decision to cancel loans and cancel debt is up to the member states to decide. And as the United Nations, we can work with member states to advance the global agenda and to help them understand the importance and benefits of preventing and addressing gender inequalities. And we can assist them in getting ahead of addressing these global challenges. But it's up to them to sort of come together and decide and facilitate dialogue is something we can do as well. But it's up to them to decide. And the Summit of the Future actually in September 2024 presents a good opportunity for advocacy. And one way to sort of influence that is that in the Summit of the Future, civil society has also been invited to give their inputs. So that's another way to have these ideas influence and shape member states' policies. But ultimately, the decision is in the hand of the member states, and we can basically just help them shape new norms. And also speaking to some of the questions on the care economy, A few recommendations that could help over here would be again to invest in infrastructure. So, for instance, water and sanitation or transportation facilities or digital services to include as many women as possible into not only the workforce but also to make life easier for them in terms of girls being able to safely go to school or girls being able to address a lot of different girls being able to access a lot of different necessary facilities that they need. A few other examples could also be conditional cash transfer programs. That could be a method of strengthening social protection mechanisms. And also the MDBs could also conduct robust ex-ante and post-impact and ex-post impact assessments to measure how macroeconomic policies impact gender inequality, and that could hopefully then lead to better solutions in closing that gender gap.
The care economy is critical for today and for the future. There were some questions about that. And I think the key is to feminize, professionalize, and pay well care work. Care work is the economy of the future because it cannot be replaced by a robot. It is based on one very human principle, which is care and love. And we should make sure that providing care and love is recognized by society the best way possible. Some societies, not 70, but 80 plus of the care work is performed by women. So there's a lot of work to do. And let me now turn to Juan Jose. You said that 3.3 billion people live in countries in debt distress, and that these are countries that pay more in their debt services than in health and education. Is that fair? I don't know. We need to do something, for a major, profound debt restructuring. But there were other questions along these lines as well. Juan Jose, what would be your final thought?
Some of the questions actually feed very nicely into the final words I had. In particular, I wanted to leave you with some more specifics on the way forward. I think a lot of the questions look at the way forward and what we need to do. From the perspective on that, like I said before, we see a long-term kind of change of the governance, but we also see a short-term provision of funds, of much needed funds. On the longer term, on the global economic governance, we see, for instance, the absence, and this is based on also looking at the summit of the future, the reform of the International Financial Architecture policy brief of the Secretary General. So there is no representative apex body that brings everything together. There's mechanisms at the G20, at the IMF, there's regional mechanisms, and there is an apex body that ensures coherence. We look at more democratic and representative decision-making rules. We look, for instance, at this has a bearing on the quotas at the IMF and delinking access to resources from quotas. Right now, 66% of special drawing rights go back to developed countries, with only 34% going to developing countries, of which only 3% going to LDCs. So we need to get the money to where it's needed most. That means reforming voting and decision-making rights, and that also goes into the reform of the international tax cooperation architecture. And there is an ongoing, it's difficult to comment at this point, because like it was mentioned, there is an ongoing process. The reality is that there is no consensus on what that process should go to. That was not equally welcomed by all member states, and there's different ideas of where that should be going, and that's something that member states will have to figure out. We also see the need for a change in the business model of development banks, because a lot of these funds will be channeled through multilateral development banks and therefore provide a much larger leverage, where every dollar that goes into that can be leveraged, I think, about 7 times in terms of lending, which is what banks can do that funds cannot do. But going to generally just, these are details. What we're thinking is we need a change in paradigm. So the change in paradigm should be from going to what we have today, where we tell countries, you have to pay your debts and remain solvent. You should not default. And then what's left goes to the SDGs. We want to go to a paradigm shift where you say, how much do you need to achieve the SDGs, and how do we make sure that you can do that and remain solvent in the process, which is a complete way of approaching the issue. But like I said before, we have also specific short-term ideas. And one of them is tackling the high cost of debt and rising risk of debt distress, massively scaling off affordable and long-term finances. So it has to be concessional, it has to be long-term. And expanding contingency financing to countries in need. And this is more than just liquidity, because that's a problem, that we see a country is in debt distress and then the issue is liquidity. So basically we're kind of delaying the pain rather than dealing with solvency in a comprehensive manner. And really making sure that this country will not be 2, 3, 5 years again in the same situation, but really coming up with a sustainable way to look to the future. And if I may, just on the second question, I think ultimately it is countries, it is governments that have to make the decision on allocating funds. So that means that we need to make sure that women are at the table to make those decisions. So we feel, for instance, that women should not be only economically empowered, but also empowered to make their own decisions in this process. And this is where SDG 5.5 comes into this, where it says, ensure women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision making in political, economic, and public life. So this is perhaps one fundamental part of this puzzle that we would like to see coming to this.
Thank you. I was shocked when you said 3% of the SDRs went to the least developed countries. So we need to change the paradigm, to change the governance, and to change the priorities. That's for sure. And thank you for the very concrete recommendations that you made. Let me now turn to the Executive Director of UN Women, Madame Sima Bauhaus, for her last reflections before I turn to the PTA for closing.
I must say that I am not really an expert. I am just an executive director. This session, and I think I enjoyed the questions that came from all of you, because they all feed into everything that UN Women is trying to do for women and for girls and for gender equality, from the care economy to other economies, to empowerment, to decision making, everything that was said here today, to even navigating bureaucracies and so on and so forth. But I think there are three really concrete, if I can say, enablers that will help us. Just to conclude, maybe this, as you were talking, I was just taking some notes. I think important for us, if we are to reach SDG 5 and all the SDGs, is to mainstream gender equality in development at all levels. I mean, this is something that is key, especially if we want to talk within the CSW 68 framework of, empowering women economically and financing for development. And that means that gender responsive budgeting should be at the top priority of all countries. Every time you are putting a budget, Mr. Finance Minister, put on your gender lens and see how this budget is going to include women and to benefit women and to ensure that your society, both men and women, boys and girls, are going to benefit from what you are going to be spending on everything that you are doing in that particular country. And I think also to help in that, collective solutions by all of us, different countries, different experts, different approaches, different perspectives should come in, and every country would choose what would be the best trajectory for them from that country. When I was recently in the Nordic countries, I asked them, what is the secret for your wealth, basically, and for your prosperity, and for the advancement that you have done? And everyone told me, in all the Nordic countries, they said the secret is women. The moment we included women in the economy, the moment we included women in the decision making, the moment we included women in political participation, we moved on and we progressed. And this is when all society participates and when no one really is left behind. This is the most important thing that we really need to do. And to learn from other countries' experiences, their thoughts. Sometimes if you go to a country, maybe you don't like 100% what they have done, but you are inspired by something they have done that succeeded, and something else that might be working in other spaces, in other countries, in other contexts. So that is important. Another enabler also for us to look at is better data and evidence, which was mentioned by Musna. And thank you, Musna, for saying that. It's shifting how gender data is collected, how gender data is used. Because without gender data, responsive policies, gender responsive policies will always be either blind or misled. So we really need to have that gender data. But I must tell you something. Ever since I was maybe even younger than Musna, we were talking about gender data and gender disaggregated data in every meeting we had. And until today, I am almost, I am beyond retirement actually, and we are still talking about gender disaggregated data. So we really need to get on the stick, as we say, and do that, all of us, different countries, organizations, especially those organizations who can afford to do that. And the last thing I want to say, which is the most important, I think, is to uphold a strong multilateral system. It is only through a strong multilateral system that we will be able to help each other, because and this is the most important. This is the international community needs to come together and help each other. The international community needs to catalyze partnerships, needs to look at gender equality, and the global multilateral system itself should be anchored in gender equality. Once we do that, all of us, then I think we will be in a better shape, all of us. And we as UN Women are happy to work with everyone to help achieve this and to help move this agenda forward. And thank you very much.
Wow. But also, these three enablers where UN Women has a central role to play. Thank you for your leadership and for the work of this space in the UN that is in charge of women's rights and gender equality. So thank you so much. PTA, Your Excellency, the last words that you would like to leave us with.
The last words that are dream-worthy. First of all, I'd like to say how very pleased I've been to be part of this discussion and to listen to the ideas of the questions that have come from the floor. I'm quite sure that many of you have been at this for much longer than I have.
Yes.
And so you understand intuitively that this is going to be a process. It's not an event. It will take a lot of commitment, a lot of energy, because change is never easy. Never easy. You have to fight for it. You have to believe in it. You have to be committed to it. And you may even have to make sacrifices for it. That is just the nature of human nature. But we know it's important and necessary for this change to take place. If we want our societies really to thrive and to flourish and to give everyone an equal chance, we can't have half of our populations left out, excluded systematically from contributing to the well-being and welfare of society. So I'd like to congratulate you all for this work that you're doing. It is important to do it, and I want to encourage you to keep up your activism. There will be times when there will be pushback, it's inevitable, but that should not, it might delay things for a while, but it should not stop you. This is extremely important for the future stability of the world and for building balanced societies where everyone has a chance. Women, girls must have the same opportunities without the hindrances that men have. And if we can do that, we will really have succeeded in creating a just, fair, inclusive world that we can all live in harmony with pride and with honor. So that's my final.
Wow, that was wonderful. It really shows that all this collective wisdom, just goes into the conclusions of the CSW document. And later in the year, in the Pact of the Future, we need, a gender-rich Pact of the Future as well. So thank you so much for being here, especially the ones that were standing up at the back of the room. And sorry for the technical hiccups here. It is not our responsibility, but we apologize for that as well. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the incredible panel and the speakers. And thank you to you for being here. Thank you.